All right. Well, good evening, everyone, and a happy Yom Ha'atzmaut to everybody. It's officially Yom Ha'atzmaut this evening, and it's I think really telling of something we spoke about over Yom HaZikaron, where the purpose of Yom HaZikaron was to reflect over the great sacrifice that the Chayalim make, and when you do so and you do it well, so then you're able to appreciate Yom Ha'atzmaut, right? So that's why we don't have months between our Memorial Day and our Independence Day. We do them within one moment, from one to the next, because once you come to that appreciation of what the Chayalim do, so then the magnitude of the nace that is Medinas Yisrael becomes highlighted. So tonight, and this is something I like to do on the week of Yom Ha'atzmaut every year anyway, is to review an important mitzvah, and the mitzvah of living in Eretz Yisrael. And the question that we're asking tonight, and life's biggest questions, is when should I make Aliyah? When should I make Aliyah? There's no question that it is a mitzvah. We're going to get to the details in a moment, but no question that it's a mitzvah to do. And therefore, just like I am an observant Jew that tries to keep and follow all of the 613 mitzvot, so then why would this be an exception? I should follow that as well. And so then what are we doing here in La Jolla, California? We should all be packing up our bags right now and getting on the next El Al flight to Eretz Yisrael. So why are we not doing that? What would be the rationale for staying in Chutz La'aretz? When should one make that decision to make the move, to make Aliyah, which is the ideal and the hope for all of us to do? So before we even begin, I want to just start with a Gemara in Masechta Rosh Hashanah, where the Gemara on Daf Lamed Amud Aleph is quoting a pasuk in Yirmiyahu, where Yirmiyahu is lamenting over the destruction of the temple, and he says, "Tzion he, that this is Yerushalayim, and Doresh Einla, but there's no one to inquire after her," meaning that it's that Yerushalayim is left, as it says in Eicha, it's left Shomema, it's left completely desolate, destroyed, totally alone and isolated. There's the Tzion he, this is Yerushalayim, but Doresh Einla, there's no one to inquire after her. So the Gemara says that what do we learn from this pasuk? Mechlal, what we learn from this verse is that dibai drisha, that we are obligated to be doresh, to inquire, i.e. drisha is another language of learning, to learn about Yerushalayim, to learn about Eretz Yisrael, to learn about these topics, that part of the real rebuilding process of Yerushalayim and part of the Geula, the redemptive process, is for us to study the laws pertaining to the land of Israel. And of course, among them is without question the mitzvah of making Aliyah, of living in Israel. The question, and it's funny even ask it as a question, as to before we get to when to make Aliyah, but is there a mitzvah to make Aliyah? Is there a mitzvah to live in Israel? That's question number one. So the short answer is yes, but we have to, of course, as we always do on Wednesday nights, we have to go back to the sources to understand what the source of this mitzvah is. The place in halacha that we find it in the Mishnayos that clearly indicate the fact that there's a mitzvah to live in Israel is in, of all places, a discussion about divorce, where the Mishnah in Masechta Ksubas on Daf Kuf Yud Amud Beis is talking about a scenario where, let's say, there's a couple who's married, and one of the spouses wants to make Aliyah, and the other does not. So that technically would be grounds for divorce. So if it was, let's say, the husband who wanted to make Aliyah and the wife did not want to make Aliyah, so then she would he'd be able to give her a get, and she would lose the value of her ksuba. And if it was the opposite, if it was that she wanted to make Aliyah and he did not, so then Bezdin would force him to give her a get. Now, Reb Shlomo Kluger, in the Elef L'Chashlomo, Reb Shlomo Kluger was one of the great Torah minds in Eastern Europe, and Reb Shlomo Kluger writes that this is not that the scenario is that one of the couples one of the spouses wants to make Aliyah because they want to go sit on the beach in Eilat and in Tel Aviv. They want to be able to go work in the startup industry in Israel, which is quite incredible. The industrialism that has taken place in Israel is just amazing, and the innovation, and really they're among leaders of the world, which is impressive in itself. But that would not be a grounds for divorce, obviously. In the same way that one would not make grounds for divorce if they wanted to move to Silicon Valley to work in the startup world. So moving to Tel Aviv for that reason also would not be grounds for divorce. Rather, Reb Shlomo Kluger points out that what we're talking about is that one of them wants to make Aliyah for the purpose of fulfilling the mitzvah of living in Israel. That if that's the case, then the other spouse is preventing them, so that would technically be grounds for divorce. Now, that doesn't mean that they have to get divorced. It just would be a rationale because one of them wants to be able to fulfill this mitzvah. And this is a halacha that applies, the Gemara says, really applies across the board, where one spouse wants to be able to fulfill certain mitzvahs that they're being held back from their other spouse. Under certain circumstances, that would be grounds for divorce. So this is no exception. What comes out from this Mishnah, it's recorded in Shulchan Aruch and Even HaEzer, Siman Ayin Hey, that we see obviously there's a mitzvah to live in Israel, right? We see obviously that there's a mitzvah to live in Israel. The Ramban, Nachmanides 1194 to 1270. As Rabbi Hirsch pointed out over Shabbos, he was 9 years old when the Rambam died, and he wanted so badly to be able to meet the Rambam. He never could. And the Ramban, he has basically the definition for the mitzvah to live in Israel. And this is probably of all of the Mar Makomos, of all of the different sources related to this mitzvah, he has it most succinctly and most clearly defined what the mitzvah of living in Israel is, and he has it as basically two distinct mitzvos related to living in Israel. One is Yishuv Eretz Yisrael, he says, is actually settling, you personally, you as an individual on a micro level, settling the land of Israel. And then there's a macro mitzvah that applies to all of Klal Yisrael called Kibush Haaretz, which is conquering the land of Israel. So there's two distinct mitzvos that are pointed out from the Ramban. One is Yishuv Eretz Yisrael, and the other is Kibush Haaretz of conquering the land of Israel. Now, what is probably, and this is probably everything I've shared till now is of no surprise really to anybody, that everything we've spoken about till now is relatively obvious to us that there's a mitzvah to live in Israel. But when you open up the Rambam in the book of mitzvahs, as we mentioned, that this is a mitzvah. So then if it's a mitzvah, it should belong on the list of the 613 mitzvahs. We know that number, by the way, 613, so it comes from a Gemara at the end of Masechta Makos, this number 613, that there are 613 commandments. How do we know? Because the Torah says the following. The verse says, Torah, Tziva Lanu Moshe, Torah was commanded to us through Moshe Rabbeinu. That Torah, says the Gemara, has the numerical value of 611. 611 mitzvot were tziva, were commanded through Moshe. And then there were two others that we know were commanded not through the intermediary of Moshe, but rather we heard straight from the mouth of God of the first two commandments. Anochi Hashem Elokecha, I am Hashem your God, and lo yeh lecha elokim acherim al panai. You're not allowed to have any other gods. 611 plus 2, it doesn't take a master's in higher mathematics to figure out, is 613 mitzvahs. So these are that's how we know we have 613 commandments. So you go through the Rambam, and many Rishonim have lists of how to figure out the 613 commandments. Do you include rabbinic mitzvot or not? Right? Let's say Hanukkah, lighting Hanukkah candles is an obligation upon us, but is it part of the count of the 613 mitzvos? Do you, for example, in in ritual slaughter, there are 4 different distinct mitzvos or actions related to ritual slaughter. Are those 4 distinct mitzvos, or are they all grouped together in one mitzvah? These are a whole slew of discussions related to how you get to the number 613, because if you do include all 4 as separate individual mitzvos, then that means that there's going to be 3 that are going to have to come off from somewhere else to get to that whole number of 613. So when you look through the Rambam's list, where he writes out the 613 mitzvos as his introduction to his magnum opus, the Mishnah Torah, where he codifies the entire Jewish tradition and all of the laws contained within, in his list of the 613 mitzvos, he doesn't include the mitzvah of living in Israel. It's very startling. Why would that be the case?
His life.
What?
His life. His family first moved to Israel. His father could make a living, and then they moved back to Egypt.
So it is interesting that the Rambam did not live in Israel, and the Ramban did end up moving in Israel. So there are some, I don't like personally saying this, but there are some who have said that the reason the Ramban was zocheh to live in Israel at the end of his life is because he pushed the mitzvah of living in Israel more than the Rambam did, and therefore the Rambam was never zocheh. But I don't like saying such a thing. I think my beard's not long enough to say something like that. But the Rambam doesn't include it on his list of the 613 mitzvos. Now, even though he doesn't include it on his list, the Rambam clearly assumes that it is a mitzvah. I mean, clearly assumes, I'll say, is an obligation to live in the land of Israel. There's a number of different sources that indicate, or not, don't even indicate, are very direct about the fact that the Rambam assumes that there is an obligation to live in the land of Israel. Number one is that the Rambam quotes that Gemara we cited earlier about the fact that if one spouse wanted to move to Israel and the other is preventing them from moving, then that would be grounds for divorce. The Rambam quotes that halacha, obviously is assuming that living in Israel is a mitzvah. The Rambam also in Hilchos Melachim, he writes, "Olam yidor adam be'eretz Yisrael." A person should live in Israel, afilu be'ir sheruba akum, even if it means you're going to live in Israel in a city that is mostly inhabited by non-Jews. Imagine that, right? You have a choice between living in Lakewood, New Jersey, or living in some of the Arab-occupied neighborhoods in Israel. Better that you go to live in the Arab-occupied neighborhoods in Israel than continuing to live in Lakewood, New Jersey. Is what that's the basic reading of the Rambam. You're not allowed to live outside the land of Israel. Even in a city that is mostly inhabited by Jewish people. So the Rambam obviously assumes that there is an obligation that one needs to live in the land of Israel. But why would he not include it in his list of the 613 mitzvos? And through this prism, through this focus as to answering the question why the Rambam left it off his list of the 613 mitzvos, we're going to learn a lot about the mitzvah of living in the land of Israel. So we're going to point out 3 different answers to this question, why the Rambam left it off his list. Let's start with number 1. Number 1 is the Stei Chemed, Hamedini, who lived from 1832 to 1904, was really an incredible author. He wrote an encyclopedia of Jewish law, really of major topics that are found in the Talmud. And the reason why that's impressive is because he wrote that without a team of scholars. He wrote that without a computer. He has a 10-volume set of an encyclopedic work going through an alphabetical order. These topics in the Talmud, it's really, I mean, that in of itself would be impressive, if not for the fact that it was also extremely thorough. It's incredibly thorough. His entry about all of the laws pertaining to Eretz Yisrael is probably like 150 pages. It is a massive work. It is unbelievable. So Haham Medini, Hamadini, clearly of Sephardic descent. For my birthday, my 26th birthday, my wife got it for me as a present. She bought me a stei chemed. Yeah, it sits in my office. It's one of the svarim I use most often. So the stei chemed, he, when discussing this Rambam, and he has a long essay about this Rambam as to why he left off the list, the conclusion he comes to is that the Rambam must be assuming that the mitzvah of living in Israel is a rabbinic obligation. It must be, it's a rabbinic obligation. Now, what would be that rabbinic obligation? Why would that be a rabbinic obligation? Why would, if it's not a mitzvah from the Torah, why would it? So the stei chemed says that the first of all, where the Ramban said that there's an obligation of conquering the land of Israel and yishuv haaretz and settling the land of Israel, he assumes that those were commandments that God gave through Moshe Rabbeinu to the Jewish people at that point in time in history. But then outside the context of that point in time of history, of that original conquest of the land, there no longer would be a continuous mitzvah for the Jewish people to settle the land of Israel. So then why would there be a rabbinic obligation? Why would the Rambam quote that it would be grounds for divorce and that one would better to live in the land of Israel and in a non-Jewish neighborhood than to live in a heavy populated Jewish neighborhood or city in outside the land of Israel? Why would that be the case? Why would the rabbis obligate such a thing? Very simple reason. Because in order to fulfill all 613 mitzvos, one technically needs to live in Israel. There's many, many mitzvos that you cannot fulfill if you don't live in Israel. So therefore, the rabbis are instructing us, we want to make sure that you are going to end up being able to fulfill the mitzvos of Shemitah and of Trumos and Maisros and of all of these agricultural laws properly. And therefore, better that you go to live in Israel, to the point that it would be grounds for divorce, and that's why it's better to live in the land of Israel in a not populated Jewish neighborhood versus outside the land of Israel, in order so you could fulfill all the mitzvos of the land. So that's the opinion of the stei chemed, that the Rambam is assuming that the mitzvah of living in Israel is only a rabbinic obligation, in order so you could fulfill all of these biblically mandated mitzvos on the list of the 613 inside the land of Israel proper. That's answer number one. Answer number two comes from the Avnei Nezer. The Avnei Nezer we've spoken about in the past was a super genius, as Reb Chaim Soloveitchik referred to him as. He lived from 1838 to 1910. He was born the same year as the Chafetz Chaim, but unfortunately he died much younger than the Chafetz Chaim. The Chafetz Chaim passed away. He was 95 years old. He passed away in 1933. In 1933, he passed away. And the Sakachav Rebbe, the Avnei Nezer, passed away in 1910. He's an incredible genius, and he was accepted as being a major Rebbe, but also not only in the Hasidic community, but in the Litvish community as well. He was accepted. Reb Chaim Soloveitchik referred to him as a super genius. I mean, he was an incredible mind, incredibly sharp. Rabbi Schechter quotes the Avnei Nezer all the time. The Avnei Nezer was really one of a kind. And he says that he thinks that for sure, without question, the Rambam assumes the mitzvah of living in the land of Israel is, without a question, a mitzvah from the Torah. It's no way that the Rambam assumes otherwise. So then we're back to our original question, being that if that's the case, why do you leave it off his list, right? 613 commandments. So if Rambam really assumed that the mitzvah of living in Israel is one of the 613 commandments, so it should be on the list. Why is it not on the list? So the Avnei Nezer said, you have to read the Rambam's introduction. The number 613 we mentioned before is a whole number that's given to us by the Gemara. But when you open up a Tanakh and you open up a Gemara, you don't find that there's only 613 things that a Jewish person needs to do. You find that there are thousands of things that a Jewish person needs to do. There's thousands of different mitzvos. So how do you get that number down to 613? So the Rambam, when he presents his list, he doesn't just throw together a list. he actually gives you his thought process. He gives you his scientific method on how to get to the 613 mitzvos with 14 principles. There are 14 sharashim, 14 principles that the Rambam uses, that he espouses and proves their legitimacy, that these 14-step process is the way you figure out how to get to what is or is not included on the list of the 613. And he writes out the entire scientific method that he came up with. It's an incredible, that in of itself is a whole study that people spend time actually studying the Rambam's whole scientific method of how you get to the number 613. So he has as one of the sharashim, one of the principles, the ninth principle that the Rambam points out is that you don't include a mitzvah on the list that contained within it he said like this: you're not going to add on an additional mitzvah to the list if that mitzvah can be included in another one, right? That if you can, for lack of a better term, kill two birds with one stone, so then that's the way you're going to include it in the count of the mitzvahs. You could have one mitzvah that has included in it multiple mitzvahs, so then you're not going to include more. So, for example, the Rambam has, for example, lulav and esrog, adasim, and aravos. Those are not four separate distinct mitzvahs. Those are all included in one. Included in taking lulav. And taking lulav, it gets included with taking lulav, or all of the four species altogether. That's where the Rambam brings it down. So living in the land of Israel, it gets included in what? It gets included in all of the agricultural laws. All the agricultural laws are assuming you're living there. You cannot fulfill those mitzvos without living in Israel. So yes, I assume that there's a mitzvah to live in Israel. It doesn't mean that it is technically on the list of 613, because it is already included in other mitzvos that are on the list of the 613. That's what the Avnei Nezer points out. So that's answer number two. Of course, the Rambam assumes that there's a mitzvah to live in Israel from the Torah. Why is it on the list? It doesn't need to be on the list separately as its own registered mitzvah, because of the fact it can be included in many other mitzvot that are already on the list. Shemitah, Yovel, all these mitzvos are assuming that we're living in the land of Israel. Answer number three. And this answer is probably the answer that has the most amount of controversy surrounding it, is basically taking the Rambam at face value, where there is no mitzvah to live in the land of Israel. According to the Rambam, some have assumed that we're going to take it at face value. It's not on the list of the 613 because there's no mitzvah to live in the land of Israel. The Megillas Esther, not the book we read on Purim, but rather a commentary on the Rambam's book of mitzvahs. The Rambam in the Rambam in his book of mitzvahs, there's a commentary on the book called the Megillas Esther, that was written by Rabbi Yitzhak de Leon, who was a Spanish commentator on the Rambam, that he died right before the Spanish Inquisition. He died right before the Inquisition, and he has this commentary on the Rambam's book of the mitzvos. He called the book Megillas Esther. He named it after his mother. His mother's name was Esther. So he wrote this book in memory of his mother, Megillas Esther. So he writes that the reason the Rambam left off the list is because he assumes it's not a mitzvah. And the Minchas Elozar was the Munkach Rebbe, and the Satmar Rebbe in his Maimer of Shalosh Shvuos assume they paskin like the Megillas Esther, that once the Jewish people went into exile, so then the obligation to live in the land of Israel had fallen away, and until Mashiach returns, until Mashiach comes and we have permission to come back into the land of Israel, so then the mitzvah will return once again. But until that point, there is no mitzvah, and that's why the Rambam did not have it on his list of the 613 mitzvahs, because it no longer applies today. Now, there are there's a major issue with this opinion. The major issue is, and I'm not a fan of espousing issues on an emotional level, right? Because that doesn't really get us anywhere, right? Rather, let's look at it from a halachic standpoint. Using the scientific method of halacha, what is the problem with this argument of saying the Rambam left it off his list because it doesn't apply anymore? There are many mitzvahs that are on the Rambam's list that don't apply anymore. Give me an example of a mitzvah that would be on the Rambam's list that doesn't apply anymore. Sacrifices. The mitzvah to build the Mishkan. Oh, these are mitzvahs that don't apply anymore. But they're there. They're on the list of the 613. Where the Rambam himself writes that mitzvah that don't apply anymore, I'm not going to include. What he meant was not mitzvah that don't apply today, but rather mitzvahs that were time sensitive to a specific generation, to a specific moment in history. Those obligations I'm not going to include on the list. You want to know what an example of that is? The Avnei Nezer writes, an example of that kind of a mitzvah that was only to a specific group of Klal Yisrael that did not apply to generations is when Klal Yisrael were standing by the Yam Suf. And Moshe begins to pray to God because they're at the dead end of the sea. And God says, Ma titzak elai, why are you praying? Why are you talking to me? Why are you really screaming at me? Daber el bnei Yisrael, tell the Jewish people, vayisau, to go cross the sea. That was a mitzvah from God to go cross the sea. Now, does that mean that there's a mitzvah for me that the next time I'm in Israel, I need to make sure that I go over to the Red Sea and I'm going to get on my bathing suit and I'm going to start swimming? No, of course not. It's ridiculous. There's no mitzvah. That's a hira'asha. That was a commandment that applied only to that specific time and place. But these other mitzvot, like having sacrifices and all the mitzvot related to Eretz Yisrael, all of these mitzvot, of course, don't necessarily apply in the same way they did before. Bringing sacrifices don't apply today. And nevertheless, they're on the Rambam's list. So that's why it's a very, very shaky argument to say that that the Rambam would not have put the mitzvah of living in Israel on his list because it doesn't apply today. No, that's not true. There are many mitzvahs that don't apply today. They're on his list. That can't be the reason he left off his list. So going back to the other two answers he had before, that the Rambam clearly assumes that it's an obligation to live in the land of Israel, whether that be rabbinic or biblical. And according to the Avnei Nezer, he assumes that it's really biblical, and that means it's biblical across the board. Because definitely the Ramban, Nachmanides, pointed out in a few different places, assumes that it's an obligation from the Torah to live in Israel. And you have the Rambam, two of the greatest Rishonim, assuming that there's a mitzvah to settle the land of Israel, to live in the land of Israel. So now what we have to get to, we have to turn our attention to, and this is basically all based off of the Avnei Nezer. The Avnei Nezer has a beautiful essay, a response on this topic of making Aliyah, of living in Eretz Yisrael, that I really think has been the guide has really been the accepted psak. It's been the accepted outlook as to how to make the decision of when to go, how to go, when to make Aliyah. So the Avnei Nezer, and what he's really addressing is basically the question that was prevalent in Eastern Europe. You have all these rebbes that are not making Aliyah. Why? What would be the rationale for such a thing? So the Avnei Nezer starts by pointing to, and I heard all this from Rabbi Shechter Shlita. The Avnei Nezer begins by pointing to a Tosfos in Masechta Ksubas. This Tosfos is fascinating. Where Tosfos, again, the Gemaras at the end of Masechta Ksubas are all dealing with the land of Israel. And I heard from Rav Shlita that, you know, all of the stories that or the non-halachic topics that are contained within a tractate of the Talmud have to have a direct correlation to the main topic of the Talmud. So, for example, all of the homiletics and stories about prayer are contained within the tractate of Brachos, right? That makes sense. It's clear. All of the stories about Shabbos are contained in Masechta Shabbos, right? All of the stories about Eretz Yisrael are all contained in Masechta Ksubos, which has to do with the marital document about the agreement that is made between a husband and wife before they get married. all to do with Masechta Ksubis. Why would all the stories of Eretz Yisrael be in Masechta Ksubis? It's a Masorah from the Gra that they need to be connected. The stories of the Masechta with the topic of the Masechta. So Rav Hirsch Shlita suggested that perhaps because Eretz Yisrael was the Ksuba in the marriage between Klal Yisrael and HaKadosh Baruch Hu that took place at Maimon Har Sinai. That at Maimon Har Sinai, that we became connected in this marital fashion, in this union as the Jewish people with HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Well, what was the Ksuba? The Ksuba was Eretz Yisrael. That was the promise HaKadosh Baruch Hu was going to give to, he was committing himself to the Jewish people, that we follow the Torah. He commits to us Eretz Yisrael, and that's what binds us. So there's a Tosos over here in Masechta Ksubas on Daf Kuf Yuram and Beis that Tosos says that the mitzvah of living in Eretz Yisrael Eino Noeg Bizman Hazeh does not apply anymore today. Why would that be the case? The Ika Sakanos Durachim, because it's very dangerous to get to Israel. It's sakana. It's life-threatening to be able to travel to get to Eretz Yisrael. Now, Tosos writing this makes sense, right? Tosos, you have to understand also, could very well be that this Tosos is being written by someone who's running away from crusaders, right? To be able to be so brazen and actually try and transverse to Israel, right? I mean, that's life-threatening of itself. And even if not for the Crusaders, I mean, just to be able to make that kind of a trek in the 12th and 13th century is something that I would imagine being very, very dangerous to do. So it's understandable why Tosos is assuming the mitzvah doesn't apply anymore today because it's too dangerous. And then he says, Omer Rabbeinu Chaim, he quotes from Rabbeinu Chaim that the Achshav Eino Mitzvah Ladur Be'eretz Yisrael. There's no longer a mitzvah to live in Eretz Yisrael because Ki Yesh Kama Mitzvos Hatuliyos Ba'aretz, because all of the mitzvah related to the agricultural mitzvah of the land, the Kama Onshin, and there are many prohibitions that would come about through not fulfilling those mitzvah properly. We don't know how to practice them properly, and therefore, being that it's like coming at risk of transgressing those mitzvos, therefore, there's no mitzvah to live in the land of Israel. Now, the Avnei Nezer points to the fact that there are two reasons given in this Tosfos why there would be no longer a mitzvah to live in the Eretz Yisrael. Either it's too dangerous to get there. Avnei Nezer says, well, that doesn't apply anymore today. Now, you have to understand, the Avnei Nezer is talking when? He lived 1138 to 12 to that's the Rambam. He lived 1838 to 1910, right? And the Avnei Nezer is saying then in the 19th century that this first reason doesn't apply. It's too dangerous to get there. Too dangerous to be able to get to the land of Israel. It doesn't apply anymore in the 19th century. If that's the case in the 19th century, so then in the year 2022, so for sure, that reason is not going to apply anymore. Of course, it is completely safe to get to Eretz Yisrael. It's completely safe, and therefore that reason falls away. The second reason that is given from Rabbeinu Chaim was that we don't know how to fulfill these mitzvos properly. Really? I mean, we have Gemaras, we have Rishonim, we have a Rambam that outlines all of the details of these mitzvos, and many of them are recorded even in Shulchan Aruch. Many of them are recorded in Shulchan Aruch. We don't know how to fulfill these mitzvahs. Sure, we know how to fulfill these mitzvahs. Why is it different than any other mitzvah? All it is just you have to learn it. You learn up the Gemaras, you learn up the Rambam, you learn up the Shulchan Aruch, and you know how to fulfill the mitzvah. That's the bottom line. So why would he say that? So in fact, the Piskei Tshuva points out that B'Shem the Ma'arit, that this was a printing error that was made by the printers of the Talmud. That it was a ta'o sofer, or it was a Talmud she'eno muga, that it was written incorrectly. That this was a misquote from Rabbeinu Chaim. There's no way he could have ever said such a thing. That there's no longer a mitzvah to live in Eretz Yisrael because we don't know how to fulfill the mitzvahs of the land. Come on, of course we can. There's a Rambam that shows us exactly what to do based off of Gemaras, Yerushalmis, etc. There is no way that Rabbeinu Chaim could have written such a thing, and therefore these two reasons fall away. So number one, too difficult to live there. We don't know how to fulfill the mitzvos. Neither of these reasons apply anymore today. Exception number two Exception number 2 found in the Gemara comes from the Gemara Masechta Bava Basra on Daf Tzadi Aleph Amud Aleph. The Gemara says the following: Tana Rabbanan, Ein yotzin me'aretz l'chutz la'aretz. You're not allowed to leave Eretz Yisrael ela imkain unless amdu satayim b'sela. Unless there is radical inflation, superinflation, and it would be that you would have to sell something that you can normally sell for satayim, for twice its cost. You're forced to sell it at half the cost, and therefore you are not able to make a living. What comes out from this Gemara? Financial hardship. If you're not able to make a living in the land of Israel, so then that would be a rationale to leave Eretz Yisrael if you're not able to make a living. Now, this reason would still hold up today. The way that the Avnei Nezer quotes and the way I heard from Rabbi Schechter is that what this means is that if it's mamash going to be too difficult for you to be able to make ends meet by going to live in Israel, so then there would be no obligation for you to go. And basically the way Rabbi Schechter says it is that you have to be honest with yourself. It's not, we don't mean that outside the land of Israel, I'm able to be a millionaire. And if I go to move to Israel, I'm only going to be able to make $900,000 a year instead of $950,000 a year, right? That is not what we're talking about. We're not talking about that kind of financial hardship. We mean that it's mamash going to be difficult. Like he tells a story about a Talmud of his that what was the name of the town that his student had moved to? It was like some very, very expensive neighborhood in Yerushalayim. And he had done very well for himself. He moved to some very expensive neighborhood in Yerushalayim, but his house was like half the size of what it was outside of Israel. But we're talking about like the difference between a mansion and half a mansion. And the Talmud was saying to ask Rav Schechter, he said, should I move back to Chutz La'aretz because I'm having financial hardship living in Israel? So, right, it's a joke, right? That's I mean, the Talmud didn't ask it as a joke, but it is a joke. Of course not. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about mamish. It's too difficult to be able to make ends meet in Israel. My grandfather had a very difficult time making ends meet. That was one of the reasons they ultimately ended up making Yerida of moving outside of Israel to America, of emigrating in the 70s. One of the major reasons why they did so was because it was too financially difficult for them to continue to make ends meet in Israel, and there was a land of opportunity in America. So that would be a rationale that would still hold up as long as the person is being honest with themselves. But if a person is able to continue to live a similar lifestyle or a reasonable lifestyle in Israel, so then the obligation would still apply. Number 3, the third exception that we find in the Gemara, it's really 3 and 4. Either to get married, you don't have to stay in Israel, or to learn Torah, where the Gemara in Masechta Avodah Zarah says that Torah v'lisa isha, that you're allowed to leave Israel in order to learn Torah or to find a spouse to get married. The Avnei Nezer goes on to try and find a common denominator, and he suggests a common denominator contained within all of these exceptions. And the exceptions, again, are financial hardships. The exceptions that would still apply today: financial hardships, to be able to find a spouse, to learn Torah. And when we say find the spouse to learn Torah, we mean that let's say culturally it would be very difficult to be able to find a girl in Israel, because let's say somebody's American, it'd be very difficult to be able to find an Israeli spouse. So it's easier for you to find an American spouse. You can stay in America in such a scenario, or let's say to learn Torah. It's easier for you to be able to learn Torah. You're going to be able to gain more Torah knowledge. The right fit of a yeshiva for you is in America or in London, and in Israel, all the yeshivas there, it's you're not connecting with them. It's not the right fit of a yeshiva. Therefore, that's what we mean that you can leave Israel in order to learn Torah. So, or don't have to move to Israel in order to learn Torah. So, the Avnei Nezer tries to find the common denominator between these different reasons. Again, financial hardship, marriage, and to learn Torah. What would be the common denominator? And the Avnei Nezer points out that we have to take a step back and go back to that Ramban, where the Ramban said, what is the mitzvah of living in Israel? The mitzvah is Yishuv Haaretz, settling the land of Israel. It's not a mitzvah to just have your physical life in Israel. The mitzvah is not to be alive in Israel. The mitzvah is to settle, to have a life in Israel. Not to live in Israel, but to have a life in Israel. That the Avnei Nezer suggests that the mitzvah of Yishuv Eretz Yisrael is to help perpetuate the Jewish people in the land of Israel. That if you are going to be a contributing member of society, so then the mitzvah would apply to you. If you're going to be a contributing member of society in the land of Israel, the mitzvah would apply to you. And that's why these exceptions would exist. Why else would where would these exceptions come from? From thin air? The Gemara and Bava Basra and Avodah Zarah just pulled them out of thin air. What would be the sources for these exceptions otherwise? Right? Financial hardship. If you're going to move to Eretz Yisrael to just to be destined to be a beggar on the street, God forbid, so then there would be no mitzvah for you to go and move to Israel in such an area. You're not contributing to the growth of the Jewish people in the land of Israel. You're not contributing to the Yishuv Haaretz, that settling, that contributing to the society, that having a life in Israel.
Ben.
And also,
Are you all right, Tony?
and also, number two is marriage. Right? I'm not going to be able to get married there. So also that same concept. So then therefore, one is not contributing in the same way that they would be able to if they can find a spouse and then move to Israel. And number three is to learn Torah. We know that, as the Minchas Chinuch writes in a number of different places, and it's very clear that learning Torah is in order to shape a person. That's why the mitzvah of getting married, the Mishnah in Pirkei Avos says, starts at the age of 18 years old. Why not 13 years old? The Netziv got married when he was 13 years old. The Netziv got married at the age of 13 years old. Yeah. Some bar mitzvah party, right? I think she was 12. Yeah. I have to look back at that. Maybe she was older than him. But yeah, he was 13 years old. 13 years old, yeah. Is when he married the sister of the Aruch HaShulchan. He married the sister of the Aruch HaShulchan, who was the Rav of Nevarde, Rav Yechiel Michal Epstein. His sister got married to the Netziv when the Netziv was 13 years old. So, so the Mishnah doesn't say that the mitzvah of getting married is at the age of 13. Why not? It's a mitzvah. You put on tefillin at the age of 13 years old. You have to start keeping Shabbos at the age of 13 years old, right? All the mitzvahs apply to somebody when they turn 13. So then why would marriage be any different? So marriage is different because unless I have dedicated some portion of my life to studying Torah and working on myself to the point that I'm ready to actually have a wife and then to bear children, God willing, to then be to be a progenitor of the Masorah, of the tradition, I need to spend time learning Torah. So that's why it's a subjective time. When is the right time for a person to get married? And therefore, the same thing would be to live in Eretz Yisrael. That if I am not going to be adding to the religious growth of the land, adding to the Jewish people inhabiting the land of Israel, by me being someone who is that has not worked on myself enough to be that contributing member of society that happens through the study of Torah, so then it wouldn't make sense for me to move to Israel yet. So these are these three exceptions. So there is one more exception that I think is related to these that Rabbi Schechter quotes. These are the three that's pointed out by the Avnei Nezer. There's one more that Rabbi Schechter quotes from the Maram Shik. The Maram Shik was one of the star pupils of the Chassam Sofer, where the Maram Shik was. This is going back to the early part of the 19th century, was was fighting the Enlightenment movement, which was the early underpinnings of the Reform movement, where in order to fight the Reform movement, so they were, he and his Talmidim were doing whatever they can to hold on to orthodoxy in Eastern Europe. In fact, that's why his last name is Schick. It was not his original last name. I don't know what his original last name was. I'm sure we could look it up, but his last name is Schick, as he changed it to Schick because there was a popular thing that people were doing was that they were changing their Jewish last names into secularized last names. So he did the opposite. He took his name and changed it to Schick, which is an acronym for Shem Yisrael Kodesh. The names of the Jewish people are holy. He changed his name to the acronym of the names of the Jewish people are holy, of Schick. So anyone with the last name Schick, if you know anyone with the last name Schick, that's what it is. It's an acronym of Shem Yisrael Kodesh. So the Maharam Schick once received a letter from one of his students, who was one of his students that had a community that also was part of this fight to try and hold on to these Jewish souls and not lose them to the Enlightenment. And he received a letter from one of his students saying that he wanted to get a bracha from the Rebbe, to get a bracha from the Maharam Schick, because he got an offer from a community in Israel, in one of these new yeshuvs, that they want him to come and be their Rav, and they'll take care of everything for him. They're going to take care of you have a full salary, we'll give you an apartment, we'll give you, plenty, everything's taken care of. Just come, paskin shalos for us, give a few shiurim, and be there for some counsel. It's everybody's dream job, right? Everybody's waiting for that offer. So he sends a letter to the Maharam Schick asking for a bracha for him to go and take this position. The Maharam Schick says, "I'm sorry, I can't." He says, and he uses the following language. He says, because a general doesn't leave his post in the middle of a war. A general doesn't leave his post in the middle of the war. So then if you're doing such a good job fighting the Reform and the Enlightenment to try and hold on to these holy neshamas, you don't have a right. A general doesn't leave his post in the middle of a war. That was the language that the Maharam Schick used. So that's what Rabbi Schechter also uses as his fourth exception to not leaving to go to Eretz Yisrael, and it's obviously related to, let's say, Lilmod Torah, related to this concept of that if a Rav or a Mechanech or a Jewish community professional is helping people in bettering themselves to hopefully get to the point where they are ready to make that move to Aliyah, they are getting closer to HaKadosh Baruch Hu and working on themselves and their midos tovos, etc. So then they're not able to leave that post. They're not able to leave that post. Rabbi Schechter shares a story that happened with him with Rav Avram Shapiro. With this, we'll close. We'll summarize and close that Rav Avram Shapiro, who was the Rosh Yeshiva of Yeshivas Merkas Harav, he was also the chief rabbi, the Ashkenazi chief rabbi in the 80s in Israel. Was an amazing Talmud Chacham. He spoke very quickly. If you think Ben Shapiro talks fast, Rav Avram Shapiro, he had to listen very carefully when he was talking because he was just moving so fast. And Rav Schechter was in Eretz Yisrael, and he gave a shir in Yeshivas Merkas Harav. And the next day after the shir, he got notice that Rav Avram Shapiro wanted to meet with him, wanted to meet with Rav Schechter. So Rav Schechter goes back to the yeshiva to go meet with Rav Avram Shapiro, and Rav Avram Shapiro sits down with Rav Schechter and offers him a job. He offers him a job. He says that you're clearly an incredible Talmud Chacham, clearly one of the next Gedolei Yisrael, and I want you to run our American program. I want you to give the shir to the boys. And similar to this whole story with the Maharam Schick and this student, full salary, give you an apartment, everything, all expenses paid. We'll take care of everything. We want you to come. And Schechter said, "I'm sorry, I can't." So Ram Shapiro said, "Why not?" He says, "Because I'm a Rebbe in YU, and I can't just pick up and leave." He says, "What would be the difference in you being a Rebbe there or being a Rebbe here? There's Talmidim there, there's Talmidim there." So Ram Shapiro keeps pushing him. He says, "What else are you doing in America?" So he says, "Well, in addition to that, I'm also the posek for the OU, and they rely on me for all of their shilas." He said, "Well, they can reach you in Israel." He said, "What else do you do in Israel? What else do you do in America, rather?" And he says, well, I almost every night of the week am going to different communities in the tri-state area of New York and New Jersey to teach Torah with lay people, with professionals, teach Torah to them. And Ram Shapir at that point says, okay, I rescind my offer. He said, I rescind my offer. Not that, okay, I understand why you turned it down. He said, I rescind my offer because you don't have a right to get up and leave America. America clearly relies a lot on, and therefore you don't have a right to leave. And so that's why Rav Shechter is still here. And Rav Shechter, there's to meet in Ohev Eretz Yisrael, there's no one like Rav Shechter. Mamish, nobody like Rav Shechter. Like I'll just share one story. Rav Shechter was once his son Rav Shai Shechter tells us that when Rav Shai first became a Rav in Long Island, so he was getting a lot of questions during the 3 weeks, 9 days period, where we're mourning the destruction of the temple. And therefore, a number of customs we take upon ourselves to mourn over the loss of the temple. And he was getting all these questions, and a number of the questions he was getting, he didn't know how to answer them. So he asked his father. He came to his father with a list of a number of different questions related to the 3 weeks and the 9 days. And so he's going down the list and asking his father the questions, and one after another, his father is saying, I don't know. I don't know. It's a good question. I don't know. There's one after another. He keeps saying, I don't know. And his son says to him that Abba, why, like, what's going on? Like, why, like, this is the first time this ever happened. Like, he's Rav Shechter, right? Like, there's no, he says, I don't know sometimes when it's a question that's not necessarily practical, but practical, just because it's maybe there's, he wants to do some research before he gives an answer. But if it's a practical question, the Rav Shechter will give you an answer. And it'll always come with a source and a Masorah. And he's, I don't know. So at this point, Rav Shechter starts crying. And he says to his son Shai, Rav Shai, he says that I never felt like I had that I had learned these laws of the 3 weeks and the 9 days as well as I did other areas of halacha. He said, because truthfully, I really never thought I'd have to paskin on them. I just assumed that Mashiach would already be here. And like that's what we're talking about, right? Like that's someone who's a real mamin, or someone there's a real appreciation for Eretz Yisrael. So again, to summarize, it's abundantly obvious and clear through all of the Rishonim and through the Gemaras and through the Rambams that there's clearly a mitzvah to live in the land of Israel. There are some opinions that are assumed in the Rambam, which, by the way, that's why it's important to recognize that there are legitimate opinions out there that would assume that the mitzvah of living in Israel is on pause and on hold right now until Mashiach comes. That's not how we assume necessarily, because we feel as though there's a majority of opinions assuming the other direction, like the Avnei Nezer, and the Ramban and the Rambam, the Stei Chemed, all the opinions we brought before, Rav Shechter Shlita. But nevertheless, there are these legitimate opinions holding not that way because of the fact that the Rambam didn't list it in his list of the 613. But even though that's the case, we gave different reasons why that might be and different exceptions to why one, even if you assume there is a mitzvah to live in Israel, why is it then that there are those of us that are observant Jews not living in Israel? And we pointed out that the exception really is that the mitzvah living in Israel is in order to do Yishuv Haaretz. That's the mitzvah, to be able to settle the land, to contribute to the society in Eretz Yisrael, to contribute to the betterment of the Jewish people in the land of Israel. And if one is not going to contribute that way, so then the mitzvah would not necessarily apply. The mitzvah of Yishuv Haaretz as to whether one would fulfill the mitzvah today or wouldn't. I just want to close by mentioning that, with Yom HaAtzmaut, there's no question that we're experiencing a nes of the Haschalta de Geula, the beginning of the redemptive process, and we're more than at the beginning of the redemptive process. I believe wholeheartedly that we're towards the end of the redemptive process, without question. It is a nes that we have Medinas Yisrael. It is an absolute nes we have Medinas Yisrael. And a quote from my Rabbi, Rav David Shlita, where there's a number of different opinions, similar to like this. There's different opinions as to whether or not there's a mitzvah to live in Israel. So we paskin that there is. So too with how you treat Yom HaAtzmaut, where we're, God willing, going to be having a Sudas Hodaya. We assume that halacha l'maisa, that Yom HaAtzmaut is a very significant day on a halachic standpoint as well, that it's a day that needs to be recognized as such, to thank Hashem for the miracle that is Medinas Yisrael. But there are different opinions that exist as to whether or not, let's say, one would say halal or shouldn't say halal on Yom HaAtzmaut. And Rav David Hirschlita, our Rabbi, pointed out to us many times that he feels as though it is so beshert, that it is such hashkacha pratis, that Yom HaAtzmaut and Yom Yerushalayim and Yom HaZikaron and these days that have just, that Klal Yisrael, that people get very emotional about the way you treat the halacha in these days, even though other areas of halacha we don't necessarily get emotional about. These areas of halacha, for understandably, people get emotional about these halachos. They get very excitable about these halachos. And Rav Hirsch felt that it is very beshert, and there's a lot of hashkacha in the fact that these days fall out during Sfiras HaOmer. During Sfiras HaOmer, why is it that we're growing out our beards and we don't listen to music and we take on these nihuge avelos, these practices of mourning during Sfira? The Gemara in Yevamos tells us because the students of Rabbi Akiva, 24,000 students of Rabbi Akiva died shelo nahagu kavod zeh b'zeh, because of the fact that they did not respect one another, they didn't respect each other, and therefore they were punished with this plague. And therefore we're taking on this mourning period. So these days that have come with them, all of this fighting, this infighting that takes place within Klal Yisrael, it's really HaKadosh Baruch Hu trying to maybe test us during this time period of how are we going to react to somebody who during Shacharis is going to step out maybe and say halal, or says halal at the end of davening, says it with a bracha, without a bracha, that there's communal tefillos, there aren't communal tefillos, there's a Sudas Hodaya, other communities wouldn't have a Sudas Hodaya. What ultimately though, if they're coming from legitimate sources, they're coming from legitimate opinions, they're trying to follow orthodoxy, they're trying to follow the Torah, they're trying their best, Klal Yisrael, they're trying their best, so then we have to be nagu kavod zeh b'zeh. Maybe HaKadosh Baruch Hu is testing Klal Yisrael right now to see how it is we're going to be treating each other on Yom HaAtzmaut. Are we going to be judging somebody if you're not wearing blue and white versus those that are wearing blue and white? How are we interacting with each other on Yom HaAtzmaut? Perhaps this is the test HaKadosh Baruch Hu is providing us, that of course everybody agrees, we all agree it's this great nace that we have in Medinas Yisrael. How we halachically treat it, so that's something that is a halachic discussion, and therefore, as the same way we do in other halachic areas, we have respect for one another. So too, during this time period, especially during Sfiras HaOmer, we want to make sure that we have respect for everybody's opinion. All right, we'll stop here for now. I wish everybody a joyous and festive Yom HaAtzmaut. I hope to see everybody at the Sudas Hodaya tomorrow afternoon at 5 o'clock. All right, we'll stop here. Good night, everyone.